Good morning, everybody. This is Chris Jones with the University of Arizona out of Gila County Cooperative Extension, and we are here with Dr. Ursula Schuch to talk about drought and extreme heat, plants responses, and landscape maintenance practices. Just a little bit about these webinars. They are a weekly Zoom webinar, 60 minutes or less, Thursdays at 11 in Arizona. We feature a variety of horticultural and natural resource topics relevant to the environmental conditions and residential concerns of Gila County, Arizona, and anywhere else in the world that you may be of interest. A recording of this presentation will be posted at this website, extension.arizona.edu/Gila, but feel free to email me at ckjones@arizona.edu, and I will send you the link to the YouTube playlist if you don't have that. And if you aren't on my mailing list, I'll add you to my Garden Country mailing list and try to keep you up to date on these webinars. And the University of Arizona is an equal opportunity affirmative action institution. And that's our cue for our AAP5 poll. So I'm going to put up the poll right now. And if you can see that, please take a moment there to respond with your age and some of those questions and information that we need to report on. And I'll get back to the slide to introduce Ursula. So here's our agenda for today. Thank you to everyone who logged in early. It's always fun to see what's happening in the background whenever I start a program. Here at 11 o'clock, I'm Chris Jones. I'm your moderator doing the welcome. Our topic today is drought and extreme heat, plant responses, and landscape maintenance practices with Dr. Ursula Schuch. She will give her presentation. She said it's going to be a little longer than 30 minutes, but please put your Q&A in the Q&A or in the chat, and I'll relay those to Ursula and we'll answer those questions. We'll seek to wrap up at noon at the top of the hour. If we still have more questions and Ursula is willing to stay with us, I'll stop the video and we'll just finish out those questions. Okay. And here's our speaker, Ursula Schuch. She's got a PhD, our professor and specialist in environmental horticulture at the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. She wears other hats, but this is the one for today. So Ursula, welcome. How are you today?
Fine. I'm excited to be here and share some interesting information about heat and drought stress.
Well, thank you very much. Looks like we got a good turnout. I see 32 attendees, so that's good for these programs to be live, and of course people watch them afterwards. So at this time, please take control of the screen, start your slides, and we are here as your wrapped audience.
All right. Welcome, everybody. I'll be talking about drought and extreme heat, how plants respond, and what you can do in the landscape to make sure that especially trees and large shrubs will survive, because they are our most important assets in a landscape, and they provide a lot of different services. So what is drought? Well, it's a period of dryness, and it can be due to a lot of different things. It can be due to low rainfall, the lack of surface or groundwater, and in many cases, it can be a combination of those. Over time, it can cause extensive damage to plants, and it occurs particularly when water is not available in the soil and the plants cannot fully hydrate. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the US Drought Monitor, and you can keep track of what's going on throughout the entire state of Arizona, and of course also other states. But we have been fortunate in having had a relatively good monsoon season this year since July, but drought is still on our mind. And let's go back to some of the temperatures that happened in June. So when we're adding heat to the drought, high temperatures worsen the lack of water because not only do you lose more water from the soil due to evaporation, but you also lose more water due to transpiration because the plants are trying to cool themselves through the leaves. So here are some of the heat records in 2020 in Phoenix. And while it's not unusual to have days above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, in 2020, there were 53 days at or above 110 degrees, 14 days at or above 115. And at night, the temperatures never dropped below 90 degrees for a record 28 night stretch during the summer. We'll talk a little bit later about why those high night temperatures are very challenging for plants. In 2021, the heat records in Phoenix has been 6 consecutive days over 115, followed by 118 degree temperature on June 17th. So these are very high temperatures, and although in the landscapes we have mostly plants that can handle a lot of the natural conditions, but these are a level of extreme that has not been seen before. So when we're looking at what's happening in terms of the plants during a natural summer and such, when the plants are dry in May, they would often wilt. But when you're seeing the example over here of the creosote, we can see that the cells are shrinking. But in this case, the creosote doesn't really wilt. The plants rather kind of come together and it looks like the leaves are folding. You can also see, in contrast to the September picture, where the leaves are well hydrated and the cells are well hydrated, the plant is not wilted. It's growing very well. Photosynthesis is going on at a good rate, and the color is very green. So when the plant in May has this yellowish hue, it just cannot hardly do any photosynthesis at all. And these high temperatures, both day and high night temperatures, really cause it to use up a lot of the carbohydrates that have been accumulated through previous photosynthesis, because the plant is essentially starving. There is only energy used for the maintenance, but not much energy can be produced with the lack of water and those high temperatures. A lot of the plants here in the Southwest have developed a lot of adaptations to use less water, and reduced leaf area is something that we see like on this acacia over here or on the mesquite, and of course on the ocotillo that in wintertime and during periods of drought will actually drop some of the leaves, and then when moisture is abundant again, it will start to regrow the new leaves in order to do photosynthesis. Some of the leaves have reflective surfaces, like the Cercis mexicana here on the right, and some of them, they have small hairs on the leaf surface, like you can see here on the Texas Ranger. A light color of the leaf surface also aids in reflecting some of the heat. And then, of course, we have hair, spines, thick cuticles, and then we have a lot of leaf root and stem succulents. And these adaptations are very useful in helping plants to weather these very extreme periods of no water, of drought, and also in some cases the heat. So the dieback that is happening, we see in summer, in the last couple of summers, that some of the mesquite and Palo Verde species, they die back, and we don't really know exactly, is it because there's a lack of water? Is it because of the high summer temperature? Or is it an accumulation of stress? Maybe there has been some compaction in an area, or maybe there has been construction and some of the roots have been damaged, maybe hardscape has been put in, or some underground work has been done. So when we're looking at how plants regulate their metabolism in order to respond to drought, the one strategy is drought avoidance or isohydry. And that is when the stomata close at a threshold water potential and the plant has accumulated a high level of abscisic acid or ABA to prevent more loss of water, and photosynthesis stops because the stomata close. So while it's a good thing to close the stomata in order to prevent more water loss, the downside is there cannot be any more gas exchange, no carbon dioxide can be taken up, and photosynthesis stops. So these plants are trying to maintain a constant midday leaf water potential. And when there's a threat of that water potential to go down, meaning there's not enough water to keep the plant hydrated to a certain level, then the stomata close. Now, on the upside, this type of regulation protects the plant from cavitation. And cavitation is when that water column that is within the plant in the xylem tissue, all the way from the root hairs to the leaves, where the water essentially flows through the xylem tissue through the entire plant. If that water column is interrupted and if air enters this, then cavitation occurs and not as much water can be translocated, and it cannot be moved as fast to the leaf surface where it is used and necessary for transpiration. Now, that is a plus side. On the other hand, if photosynthesis doesn't take place, there is the potential problem of carbon starvation, because all the reserves that the plants have accumulated through previous photosynthesis, they are now used for respiration, essentially for energy to maintain the plants. So the plants that rely on this type of drought avoidance mechanism, they have deep root systems to supply the water. Now, another strategy that plants have is drought tolerance or anisohydry. So the stomata there, they remain open under very high negative water potential. So the plant is gambling on, at some point, there will be water again, and or my roots will grow to a point where they can take up more water, and they do allow the midday leaf water potential to decrease. So the plant can get quite stressed. The upside is, as long as there is gas exchange and carbon dioxide can enter the leaf, photosynthesis continues and carbon is gained. The potential problem is if that water potential gets so low and there is no more water entering through the root hairs, then cavitation can occur. And if this is at a very extreme level, then the plant may die, or parts of the plant may die. So the strategy for plants that are using this mechanism is to have cavitation-resistant xylem cells. So they have very thick xylem cells compared to the ones that usually rely on drought avoidance. Now, throughout all of these strategies, there are definitely cellular metabolism limitations, because when you have low tissue water potential within a plant, the metabolism is limited and the plant does not have energy to really do everything to maintain what needs to be done, but also to grow. So usually growth will decline. The other thing is there is a low production of carbohydrates, and so maybe some of the reserves will be dipped into. And then there are a lot of secondary metabolites that need to be produced for the defense from pathogens and insects, and they may not be produced at the levels that are necessary to fend off some of these organisms. So you may know that some of the pines, when they're severely stressed, they may be prone to be attacked by the pine bark beetle because the plants don't produce enough resins anymore and other metabolites to successfully fend them off. So here's just a little comparison. On the left, you can see the isohydry, the plants that have the high ABA levels, there is slow recovery and early loss of photosynthesis. Stomata are closed pretty quickly. On the other side, we have the N-isohydry. We go really as far as possible down in the water potential and try to extract water from very dry soil. And so usually those plants have xylem that is more robust, has thicker cells, cell walls, and cavitation can be a problem. So here are some of the examples. Pinus edulis, the pinyon pine, is an example for the former, and a juniper is an example for the latter mechanism. So can we select tough trees based on physiological traits for the future? Well, when we have the N-isohydry tolerant plants, those are usually arid and semi-arid plants, angiosperms, and they have the high wood density, and they have the greatest resistance to embolism, like the juniper. And then the avoidance plants, they usually are mesic plants, so they are used to more deeper root systems and such. And those are mostly gymnosperms, and the pinyon pine is one of these examples. But the drought-induced mortality is never associated with the single mechanisms. And what the latest research or more recent research has found out is some of the desert plants, they can change from one mechanism to the other, sometimes day or night, or sometimes when water is available, they may change from one mechanism to the other to take the greatest advantage of these different strategies and to maintain photosynthesis. So the water stress will hinder the flow of water, and one of the problems is that the roots will shrink from the soil, and then during cavitation that water column can break, and you can see in this image down here there is water now entering a xylem cell. And so this is an embolism, and the water that is below that air bubble cannot really move up. There are sometimes mechanisms of repair. Sometimes water can very slowly move in from adjacent cells, but in general, the larger vessels do not have a very good mechanism of repair, and the easy pathways then are blocked. So that means once cavitation has occurred, then the water cannot move as freely from the root hairs all the way into the leaves and through the stomata. What are the chemical signals that are produced in response to water stress? This is a very old experiment that had been done where people were wondering, will the roots respond, or how are the roots involved in sending signals to the shoot to close the stomata? And so people put roots in two different pots from the same plant. And one pot was well supplied with water, the other one was kept dry, and it was found that all the stomata partially closed, although enough water could move into the cell. So what we know is that the water deficit enhances the root extension into moist soil, and there is more root growth than that will proceed in the moist soil compared to the dry soil. And drought then decreases the leaf area, but more photosynthetes move to the root. So if you have a plant that is drought stressed, it will generally allocate more of the photosynthetes to root growth in order to produce more roots that can seek out the water. Osmotic adjustment is another mechanism that the plants are using to adjust to drought. So the cells increase the solutes by accumulating sugars, amino acids, and certain ions. And that helps to maintain the plant turgor. In other words, the plant does not wilt, but it can only increase the dehydration tolerance. So it doesn't really help extract more water from the soil. And in general, this mechanism is started when the plant is water stressed and more abscisic acid is produced. So it's a chain reaction. Now, what happens to the plant during heat stress? All the things that we looked at so far have been in response to drought stress. The water loss from plants and soil is, of course, accelerated because more water is lost to evaporation and more water is lost to transpiration from the plant surface. And at night, when the temperatures are high, there will be higher respiration rates, and during the day, there will be less photosynthesis. So overall, this depletes the carbohydrate reserves that the plants had accumulated, and it doesn't really fill it up fast enough. So there is essentially starvation happening. And then the high temperatures alone, even in the absence of drought, they can damage the photosynthesis system. And this is irreversible. And then if the photosynthesis system is severely damaged, what you will see is the leaf turning brown, and essentially it will die, because these cells, if they cannot perform photosynthesis anymore, they will not be able to keep on living. Another negative effect of heat stress is the production of reactive oxygen species, and those can be toxic to plant cells and cause damage. When the plants are under heat stress, many will produce heat shock proteins that allow them to operate more or less as well as they can under the conditions and maintain metabolic rate and photosynthesis, but it will always be at lower rates. But what you will see under sustained heat stress is that leaves and branches can be scorched, and eventually they will die and abscise, and the entire plant can die. So what people have learned is that the tolerance to extreme high temperature differs between plants, and it usually is contingent upon what species you are dealing with. A lot of the native plants that we have are able to cope with the heat stress. But again, the temperatures that we've been experiencing have been well above what has been normal high temperatures before, and also the duration has been much longer than before. Some of the cultivars will be able to better deal with some of the heat stress. And then also, what is the plant status when it goes into that heat stress? Has it already been stressed for 3 years with below par irrigation? Has there already been salinity accumulation for months or years? And then what were the weather conditions before the heat stress event? Had it been already very hot and extremely dry with low humidity, which really caused already desiccation of the plant? So these are some of the additional stresses the plant has to deal with when there is drought and when there is heat stress. And responses to drought, and in some cases also to heat stress, are of course wilting, sun scald, and the branches, they can die, the bark can fall off, there can be sunburn of the branches of the leaves. And then one of the first responses, even before any leaf will wilt, is the reduction of cell expansion. So as a plant grows, there is continuous cell division and cell expansion. That's how plants are growing. And immediately when the roots sense there's not enough water anymore, both division and the cell expansion will stop. So growth stops right away. There could be potentially increased insect or disease damage, and especially in trees, the symptoms may be visible quickly, especially on broadleaf trees, but not necessarily on trees that have a much stiffer leaf. they don't visibly wilt. They may maybe try and roll up a little bit, or they may curl a little, but in conifers, for example, you don't really see any symptoms of wilting. And over time, some of the severe stress can take years to be manifested in a tree, to where you see dieback, or where you see actually the death of a tree. And the damage that caused this may have happened 2, 3, or 4 years before. Here is an example of the pine trees that have died. This is an older study, and the pinyon pine between 2002 and 3, they died at very high levels in Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. And you can see there were thousands of square miles that died. And what was found is that a recent drought from 2000 to 2003 was hotter than a previous one in the 1950s, but that drought was drier, but fewer trees died. So what people thought is the reason why this happened in the early 2000s was that it was a combination of high heat and drought that made the trees more susceptible to the insect infestations. So the question is always, why does a tree die, and could we have done anything about it? We talked already about some of the mechanisms that the plants have adopted in order to deal with the drought. So is it hydraulic failure? Has there been cavitation? Is there no more water that can get up into the canopy? Or is it carbon starvation because the plants have closed the stomata too soon and they cannot actually produce enough photosynthetates to replenish what is being used and what is being also depleted during those warm nights with the high levels of respiration. So here's an example of Scots Pine that died 4 years after drought, and it was because of the carbon starvation. And the researchers found that the carbon reserves and the canopy defoliation determined whether the plant was able to recover or not recover. Another study looked into quaking aspen and how that would be affected by drought. And they found that there was a lethal plant water stress threshold that responded then with the vascular system not being able to transport the water up anymore, essentially because of cavitation in this case, not because of carbon starvation. And they could predict in the case of quaking aspen then with a 75% accuracy whether regionally plants would die because that threshold of water potential had been reached and exceeded or not. However, this is very species specific, of course, but there is research going on into trying to understand what mechanisms the people are using, or are there any interventions we could do? Of course, this research was done in natural ecosystems, whereas when we're dealing in the urban environment, watering the trees, trying to make sure they don't experience such extreme water stress levels and such low water stress thresholds, that can help us to keep the trees healthy. So the oaks, are they drought avoidance or drought tolerance? We grow a lot of oaks here. They grow naturally in different ecosystems, but we also grow different oaks in the urban landscapes. And it turns out that the oaks have the ability to either avoid or to tolerate water stress, or do both. They generally have a deep penetrating root system to pick up the water from the lower parts of the soil. They have thicker leaves, relatively small stomata, which aid in preventing that fast water loss through the stomata. And it turns out that some oaks from the warmer regions, they have larger stomatal pores. And some oaks that have ring porous xylem anatomy, that allows the water movement to rapidly occur. So if there is water, these species, as long as there's water present, can really transport water very fast. But on the other hand, of course, during drought, they only can go so far until the vessels will cavitate. So it turns out then that the oaks maintain a higher rate of photosynthesis at low leaf water potential and a high vapor pressure deficit than other species. So the oaks seem to be pretty competitive in dealing with drought. And it turns out some of them also undergo osmotic adjustment that we talked about before, another mechanism to help with drought conditions and to make sure the plant does not wilt early. So oaks they have really adopted a lot of these strategies, and it has been found that the different species, they're able to go back and forth between the different mechanisms of tolerating or avoiding drought. Now, the alligator juniper, that is one of the most drought-tolerant conifer species. And while this is a tree that grows at higher elevations, there has been some interesting research that was done here in Arizona in Walnut Gulch. And they showed that the species that were from the lower elevation, they were drought avoiders, but the ones from the higher elevation, they adjusted osmotically, they dropped their water potential, so they were drought tolerant. So even though in the same species, there are differences depending on whether the plants are from low or from higher elevation. And then the low elevation, they allocated more biomass to the roots than the high elevation species. And that is essentially the strategy. The more roots a tree has, the more access to water it has. So it's very interesting how even within one species, the trees use different mechanisms in order to cope with drought. What should you do during drought to keep your plants safe? Minimal fertilization, because fertilization will stimulate growth. And when there's not enough water, the last thing you want to do is stimulate growth. Fertilization can also increase the salinity because it introduces more salts into the soil, and thus it can further stress the plants. And also, if there is not that much water in the soil, it can make it more difficult for the plant to get that water into the tree. Don't do any major pruning because you would be reducing the amount of leaf area that can do photosynthesis. The trees and large shrubs should be slowly and deeply irrigated to and below beyond the drip line. And you don't want to overwater, because when you overwater, then there is not enough air in the root zone. And when you have standing water in the root zone, that prevents essentially respiration of the roots and also contributes to starvation of the plant. So some of the tools that we have to look at what is the soil moisture, there are different soil moisture gauges. You certainly would want to know what amount of rain has been coming down onto your soil so that you can maybe skip an irrigation, conserve some water, and also prevent overwatering. And soil probes that you put into the soil in order to sample how moist the root profile is are very helpful to understand how long you have to water to get to the depth of 2 to 3 feet that that is where most of the roots are located. Using a drip irrigation or soaker hoses are also very good strategies to make sure that your water is evenly distributed over the root zone. So how do we make sure that in a hotter, drier climate, we maintain trees that are healthy, that fulfill all the services that we want, which is shade and buffering, wildlife habitat, maybe a noise barrier and such, trees with flowers or fruit. So how do we know what is the minimum amount of water that we need to give these trees in order to thrive? Well, my colleague Ed Martin and we did an experiment for several years at the Maricopa Ag Center, just southwest of Phoenix. And we grew 9 different species of trees with different irrigation regimes to find out, is it possible to grow these trees with different amounts of water, or is that something that is not possible? So what you want to do is you want to save the trees, because the trees and also large shrubs that may be used as hedges, they are the longest living plants in the landscape. They're very costly to replace, and the small trees that you may replace a large tree with that might have died due to drought or due to insect infestation or disease, the small trees will take a long time to rival giving us the benefits that we get from trees with very large canopies. How do you estimate how much water a tree needs? So you need to know what the particular plant needs. You know, a mesquite needs different amounts than a palm tree or some other broadleaf trees. You could actually calculate the area that needs to be wetted, so the root zone. Where are the roots of these palms? Over here. So some of them may be, you know, in this area. Usually the palms, they have their roots relatively close to the stem, maybe between 2 to 4 feet, maybe up to 6 feet away from the stem. But in general, a lot less than a large mesquite like this would have. This one has roots all over under the hardscape and well beyond this very small cutout, where you can see now where the trunk enters the soil. Next, you need to know what type of soil you have. If you have a clay soil, then you have a higher water holding capacity than a sandy soil, meaning you water less often than in a sandy soil. And then you want to know how much water can be depleted and still ensure good crop or plant growth. And then you want to know how much water you need to apply to restore that soil moisture again. And then how well is your irrigation system designed and maintained, meaning how even is the application? Do all the drippers really give you the same amount that it says? Is it like a 1 gallon per minute, or a 3 or a 4 gallon per minute drip emitter? And do all the emitters in your landscape really give the same amount of flow rate that you think they have? So checking the irrigation efficiency of a system is often something that can be very helpful to make sure the soil, the soil where the roots are is sufficiently wetted. And then, of course, what is the water quality? If you have higher salinity, you need to water a little bit more in order to flush some of those salts below the root zone so the roots don't get damaged. This is the study that I was talking about earlier. And so we had conifers, we had broadleaf trees, we had some native and some desert adapted plants. And we found that the species that were not tolerant to the drought, to the low irrigation level, were the Rio Grande Ash, Afghan pine, and the Arizona cypress. You can see those under the lower irrigation treatments. They look wilted, and the pines, they would lose a lot of needles, and there was definitely some branch dieback. So what we found is when we looked at how many, what is the percentage of irrigation that we need to give these plants so that they can thrive and maintain a healthy canopy and still can keep growing. We found that when we're looking at the amount of irrigation in relation to ETO, the reference evapotranspiration, we would need to replace about 60 to 80% of that reference evapotranspiration year-round for the Arizona cypress and the Afghan pine. So these trees do not do well with drought. And of course, they don't really show you wilting because those needles are very stiff, and they would maybe show you that, that they are in trouble in terms of water because they would turn yellow or brown and such. The Rio Grande Ash, which we also know, it is adapted to our arid areas, but it does need more water. And it is a Southwest native, but still, we think that during the summertime, from May to October, this would need about 60 to 80% of ETO, and that's the same that the pine and the cypress would need. But in wintertime, only 30 to 40%, and the reason is it goes dormant, so there are no more leaves over there. And you can look up the evapotranspiration, that ETO, you can look that up at the Arizona ASMET site. So that is a site that shows you how much water of a reference crop is essentially used during the different months of the year. Now, the live oak was another one that can really thrive better if in summertime it gets 60% of ETO and in winter 30%. But all the other trees that we use, the red push pistache, desert willow, Texas ebony, Palo Verde hybrid, and the velvet mesquite, they did really well with our lowest level of watering, and that was 40% of ETO during the summer month and 20% during the winter month. So what does that mean in terms of irrigation? When you're looking at the number of irrigation events, this is here from a period of May to March the following year, we had 19 irrigation events in the wet, so in the most well-watered irrigation treatment, and 9 in the dry one. And then essentially the average days between irrigation, they varied between 15 days to 37. But what was most amazing is that when we looked at the amount of rain that we had, and then we looked at the wet treatment in the winter time, we actually did not water these trees for 124 days. But in the dry treatment, where we allowed the soil moisture to be depleted much more, it was over 160 days. So we're talking a couple of months without any irrigation. And the reason was there was some natural rain that also fell during that time. Now you can look at other sources, and you can look, for example, at the Water Use It Wisely. This is a pamphlet by AMWA that you can look at on the internet. And the number of irrigations that they use are a little higher. So they err on the side, it's better to give the plants more water than less water. And so for the low water use plants, they gave about 13.5 irrigations per year, the high ones 34, whereas in our treatments, we went from 9 to 21, from the lowest, the dry treatment, to 21 for the wettest. So you will find a lot of different information, and there has not been that much research because it's it takes a long time to do this kind of research. And then, of course, a lot of it will depend on your local soil moisture and on so how long in the type of soil that you have will the soil moisture be maintained so that the plants can still take up the water. So when you irrigate, you want to make sure that you irrigate within the drip line and outside the drip line. And here's an example of a tree with a spreading root system or the palms. And you want to irrigate 2 to 3 feet deep because we know that is where the majority of the root systems are located. And you also want to mulch that entire root zone because that then helps to maintain the soil moisture and so less water is lost due to evaporation. And again, in order to test how deep does your water actually penetrate into the root zone, you may want to use either, just something so you can tell how wet is the soil. Can I penetrate it with a rebar or a metal tool and go down 2 to 3 feet? And we know that the plants that are watered deeper, they will also then, of course, develop a deeper root system, which will give them better anchorage during high winds, especially during the monsoons. So they will be less prone to be thrown by storm. And then when no regular irrigation is installed, you can use a soaker hose and sort of try to cover that area. Also make sure that if you're using irrigation, that you're able to skip, that you skip the next irrigation if you had enough rain. And then another strategy is just to have a simple basin here that would be about at or a little bit beyond the drip line that you can flood. And then for small, recently transplanted trees, you could use an apron that you can fill with water, where the water then slowly soaks into the root zone, and it will both soak the newly transplanted root ball and the area around it. So these are good options if there is no permanent irrigation system installed. And then a lot of this information and a lot more is actually in these publications. So one is very recent on drought and extreme heat, and it talks about some of those responses and mechanisms that we discussed earlier, and some of those landscape practices in making sure that the root zone is adequately wetted so that the plants can grow and thrive. And then the study that I showed you very briefly on the irrigation of the 9 different species, that is another cooperative extension pamphlet. And then in June, some colleagues from the U of A and the Arizona Community Tree Council and Tucson Clean and Beautiful and a couple of other colleagues, we got together and developed this Arizona Urban Tree Stress Alert, because in June, of course, we had these record temperatures. The drought was essentially exacerbated because we had a very poor monsoon last year, and then also very poor winter rains. And that is why this pamphlet was developed. So you can just easily look this one up by going on any search engine and type in Arizona Urban Tree Stress Alert. And it's a 1-page pamphlet, and you could use that to maybe alert people that you're working with that should know about this, because yes, we had a lot more rain, but it will not last forever. And there's a good chance that we will get into drought conditions again. So at this point, I'm ready to move to the questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Ursula. We learned a lot there, and some of the science behind what we understand, and why trees fail, and trees that we can work with to try to keep them alive. So really appreciated it. And let's jump into some of these questions here. We'll start on the chat side. So Michael asked, what does the split root system experiment suggest regarding drip irrigation for trees with limited emitters?
That's a very good question. As far as I know, on the having limited number of emitters is something that our trees can cope with. So the trees may be under stress, but the root system still is moistened adequately as long as you see new growth on your trees. So the trees may be in a permanent state of alert in terms of maybe not doing as much photosynthesis, but a lot of it will really depend on the species that you're dealing with. So if you have a let's say, an ash tree, it's probably better if you can cover more of that root zone and moisten that more than a tree that we know is extremely hardy and can handle drought a lot better.
All right, good. Another question is, are there any ground covers that are heat and or drought tolerant that don't have deep roots? This person is looking to plant something over their septic tank and field and won't have roots growing down into it.
Well, the ground covers, most of them are shrubs, and so we would expect them to grow to a depth between like 18 to 24 inches. And that's a very good question. I think they would not go much lower than the 24 inches. A lot of the ground covers do not have the tap roots like trees. And so I think a lot of ground covers would be suited to be grown on a septic system. I don't know exactly what would be the common amount of soil that you have before a plant reaches the septic system.
And that's a good question, but it probably should be in that 2 to 3 foot area, depending on, was it properly done? Do they have the soil, things like that for growing septic tanks. But I thought that was an interesting question where you were saying use mulch over that tree zone or root zone of the tree. Would a ground cover like that be able to serve a similar purpose, or is it going to compete for water? It certainly competes for water.
The ground cover would do both. It would shade the soil, but it also would compete for water. But I think in the future, people will be looking more at using ground covers because they do have the ability then to transpire and potentially cool off the soil. One of the things that has been found in research in the Phoenix area is that during the night, when you have trees that are relatively densely planted, sometimes the soil below, if you have bare soil, it will not be able to cool off. And so, you may just lose a lot more water due to evaporation in that way. And I don't know that anybody has done exactly the quantification of how much water it would cost and potentially the savings and the cooling of the environment. I think it would, you're looking more at just water use. You're also looking at, potential environmental benefits in cooling the area.
Good ideas and research. And along that line, Izzy asked, where can I find this information on Southwest native and desert adaptive plants? I went ahead and put in the link to AMWA's plant list, native, and because maybe you can speak to a little bit more, but our native plants and desert adapted plants, are a list of plants that we know will do well under our conditions. Is there anything more about that to discuss?
The only one that I would add too is the low water use list for the different active management areas from the Arizona Department of Water Resources. So if you could put that in the chat, I think that would be very helpful, because if you're in an active management area, then there have been landscape lists that were issued and that help you to understand, what are low water use plants. And then if you want to make sure you have plants that are, low water use and also suited for your elevations and such, I think you get a lot of good information there.
Okay, what was that other, and people were asking for some of those resources that you mentioned. I can make those available at my website when I get this posted. Another great place to find any of these publications is at our arizona.edu/pubs, and be able to find these research that Ursula mentioned.
Right.
Yeah. So Michael asks you to comment on the use of shade cloth. It reduces solar heating, but also reduces sunlight for photosynthesis.
Well, shade cloth is very useful, especially when you're dealing with smaller plants in a nursery situation, or if you're dealing with plants that may have been recently transplanted, let's say saguaros, for example. And shade cloth that you would want to use in that particular case is about 30% and not more, because otherwise you can really decrease photosynthesis too much, especially if you're, let's say, growing plants in a nursery situation, or if you're growing even vegetables. Some of the gardeners here in the lower desert areas in Phoenix, Tucson area, Pinal County, they're using the 30% shade cloth to grow some of their summer vegetables under, because it really reduces the heat. And then if we're getting into that, we can even talk about, you could use the silver colored illuminate type 30% shade cloth, and that helps additionally to disperse the light into the canopy, but at the same time it reflects some of the light, so it can actually further reduce your temperatures and further reduce your temperature stress to the plants.
Thanks for adding that to it. So good uses of using those shade cloths. Okay,
Yes.
so over with our Q&A list. Yeah, where do I find these pamphlets you referenced? And so we can try to get those.
I can make a handout that you could just post then as a PDF, and also add that low water use plant list for the different active management areas, so people can look it up. This is Arizona specific, of course. Another list where you can find some of the water uses of plants is the Wookles list that comes out of the University of California. And they have put a lot, I mean, there are now hundreds of trees, ground covers, grasses, and such on there. But again, a lot of that has not been tested through research. So it gives you an approximation.
Good,
so
yeah.
I will put all these resources in a handout then.
Great, and I can share that out with my mailing list. Super.
Yes.
So Claudia is asking some questions on cavitation. So does the tree show signs of this happening? Does it change the leaf growth or the bark look different? What do we see when cavitation occurs?
The symptoms are non-specific to cavitation, but there is actually equipment that arborists can use, and you can, and researchers have been using that to listen to the popping when the embolism occurs. So as people have put plants under drought stress, they have essentially, they take acoustic measurements from the trees, and they can measure that embolism occurs. But it's not a quantitative measure. You know, they just know it occurs and maybe the frequency when it occurs. But people also then have looked at how much does it decrease, or what's the recovery rate of the plants once they are being rehydrated. So that is the only measurement of the embolism that I'm aware of. But again, it is more qualitative, you know, how often does it happen and when does it happen, but not how much does it stress the tree. A measure of tree stress is usually measuring the leaf water potential, and then having an understanding of what would the leaf water potential of this particular plant be in a well-watered condition, and how much would it decrease if we are putting the plant under severe stress. And then also, what is the recovery rate? How long does it take for that leaf then to essentially go back to the full well-watered type of leaf water potential? And then, of course, if you can measure photosynthesis rates at those same times, that gives you a quantitative measurement of how much photosynthesis is reduced.
So when I think about cavitation, it can happen anywhere throughout the cambium or the xylem, and we've got hundreds, if not thousands, of you know, pathways, those vessels going up and down a trunk or whatever the plant is. So if a few of those vessels cavitate, it's probably not a great deal, big deal. If many of them do, then I guess the plant can fail. Do we see that? I'm sorry, just like you said, will branches fail or what? Yeah, sorry.
So it depends on where it occurs.
Mhm.
And what has been found is actually that the plants in our arid area are remarkably resistant to cavitation. But also the research is not as far developed that I think we understand everything about it and how much it is actually affecting the tree, you know. So the extent of the damage, I don't think we can say once cavitation occurs, you know, limbs will fall. Maybe only leaves will fall. And I think it also depends on the tree. And like you mentioned, if a few of those xylem vessels cavitate, maybe no big deal. But it's possibly, when I think about when a tree is affected by drought, I'm thinking that, you know, maybe if it goes above a certain percentage of the xylem area that will be impacted, you know, maybe it's 20, 30 or 40%, I don't know. Maybe then it gets to this threshold level where, you know, a limb will fail or the whole tree will fail.
Yeah.
So I think we still have to see some more research in understanding more what the exact effects are.
Thank you. You know, it's just gotten me really interested in it. And, how is it related to permanent wilting point or not?
Well, the permanent wilting point is essentially the amount of root moisture when a plant is growing and root moisture sort of goes below a certain point, and then the plant is not able to pick up any more water anymore through the root hairs, and then it will reach the permanent wilting point, meaning really all the stomates have to be closed.
Yeah.
And, you know, in some of the leaves you would see that, like in an ash tree or, you know, in some other trees with that type of leaves. But again, permanent wilting point in a pine or in a live oak where you have, you know, very stiff leaves, you wouldn't even see that. It's determined by the threshold water potential then that you would measure with, you know, a pressure bomb.
So two unique phenomena. It's not the same.
No, it's not the same.
Okay, so one attendee is asking, is this webinar being recorded for Master Gardener viewing lately? Perhaps yes, it is. So I will get that. My campus colleague has been super about getting that done. We will probably have it up by tomorrow, but usually it's 1 to 7 days, just depending on workload. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and show our closing slide. I think there's a few more questions to cover. And if you're willing to stay with us, Ursula,
yes,
and finish this up. So thank you so much. Here is Ursula one more time. Hooray. Thank you so much for your research and your presentation. You know this all so well. And we've just had our quick question and answer discussion. Thank you. And next week, please come back. We've got Bill Cook from Greenlee County again, our horticulture extension leader there. He's going to be talking about seed saving. So this is a popular time to do the seed saving. He said it's because we know which ones are our champions. We know which ones are those going to give us good seeds. So with that, thank you very much. We'll see everybody next week and have a good day.